The creature hadn't let anything live this close in 11,000 years. That was the first thing Director Avris Kale saw when the feed came up on his monitor. Not the alarms, he'd heard those already, all 4 tones at once, the specific sequence that meant extinction-class containment breach. Not the 3 handlers down in the corridor outside Sector 4, their biometrics flatlined into unconscious. What he saw was the sensor readout for the only warm body still standing in the radius, and what it said was, heart rate mildly elevated, cortisol baseline, stress index. The system had actually flagged a question mark, because it had no category for what it was reading. Mild interest. Kale's 4 hands moved without him, deciding to move them. 2 hit the command console, pulling up the Deck 4 security feed. 2 found each other behind his back and held on. His staff recognized that second gesture. None of them said anything. On the monitor, the Dravathi cub filled most of the frame. It was roughly the size of a large Earth predator. Kale had read the comparisons in the briefing files. Back when having a Dravathi specimen on Wellport 6 had seemed like a controlled situation. The cub stood about 1.4 meters at the shoulder, its hide the deep flat black of space between stars, no light reflection at all. 8 eyes arranged in an asymmetric arc across its skull, tracked in 8 different directions simultaneously. The bone-ridged crown along its head was fully extended, fanned out to maximum width, the way the research files showed it looked when a Dravathi was actively preparing to kill something. Bioluminescent markings ran the length of its body, cycling through a red Kale had never seen outside of photographs. Red, that meant threat. Red, that meant the pheromone glands behind each of its jaw joints were running at full output, flooding the air with compounds that should have dropped any carbon-based organism within 40 meters before they could take a second breath. 3 of Kale's handlers were already in the corridor. They would confirm this later, the ones who could speak again. The 4th warm body in Sector 4 was a human. She was mopping. Briggs, Kale said, reading the name off the personnel tag in the corner of the feed. Nola Briggs, evening sanitation shift, Deck 4. He pulled her file with his upper left hand. His upper right was already on the emergency comm line. Someone tell me her classification. Technician Saurus, a junior Turthin barely 2 years out of the academy, read from his console in a voice that had stopped sounding like words and started sounding like a translation error. Maintenance tier. Non-specialist. Prior work experience listed as, he stopped. Saurus. Multi-species rescue farm, Northern Coast, Earth. A pause. The intake system categorized it as agricultural, non-relevant. Kale looked at the feed. The woman, medium height, dark hair pinned back with the kind of efficiency that meant she did it every morning without thinking, had paused her mopping to look at the Dravathi cub. The cub was 2 meters away from her. Its crown was fanned to full extension. Its markings were cycling red. It was making a sound that the audio sensors registered as a sustained low-frequency vibration, the kind that the research files noted could cause involuntary muscle spasms in most known species at close range. She tilted her head. "Oh," Nola Briggs said, and her voice came through the feed speakers like someone who had just noticed a cat stuck in a tree. "You poor thing. You're completely turned around, aren't you? No panic, no screaming, no running." She went back to mopping. Somewhere in the command tier, senior researcher Pelvarath made a sound like all 4 of his gill slits had tried to close at once. "She didn't run, she didn't fight. Stay close, you'll want to see exactly how this ends." 43 minutes earlier, Wellport 6 had been running a routine transfer. The station smelled, as it always smelled, of recycled air and industrial disinfectant. 17 decks, roughly 200 permanent staff, a biological research mandate that covered 700 active species, and a containment wing that had its own power grid, its own atmospheric processing, and its own emergency override system completely separate from the rest of the station. The IBCA had built it that way on purpose. The idea was that if anything in the containment wing went wrong, you could seal it off entirely and lose the wing without losing the station. This had seemed like excellent planning at the time. The Dravathi transfer had been logged as routine. A juvenile specimen, designated Unit Thresh 9 in the concordance records, being moved from long-term holding in the outer wing to the active research floor for a cataloging session. Standard procedure. The handlers had Class 7 protective gear, pre-authorization from the Collective Diplomatic Office, and a transport seal rated for mature adult Dravathi containment, which was on paper more than sufficient for a cub. What the transfer team had not accounted for was a hairline fracture in the seal's secondary locking mechanism. 3 months old, noted in a maintenance report, filed, and never acted on because the station was perpetually understaffed, and the Dravathi wing was listed as low priority for routine upkeep. Because the Dravathi were not supposed to be touched without 6 forms of clearance anyway, so how urgent could it really be? Kale had read that report 4 hours ago. He had signed off on the staffing decision that deprioritized the repair 8 months before that. He was aware of both facts now in a way that felt very loud. The seal had given way at 19:34 station time. The Cub had walked out into Sector 4. The 3 handlers with it had gone down within seconds. Pheromone exposure, involuntary, nothing they could have done. The automatic containment fields should have activated. They had not. Kale had been trying to understand why for 43 minutes. The sensor array ran its threat assessment, Sora said, reading from the incident log in the flat voice of someone who had accepted that nothing he said for the rest of the evening was going to make sense. It scanned for threat-class organisms in the active zone. It found... He stopped again. Found what, Soris? It found one warm body registering calm heart rate and baseline stress markers. Sir, the system didn't activate the field because... He looked at his console. He looked at Kale. Because it didn't detect a threat. Pelvarath, who had run to the command tier from the research wing, still holding a data pad, and now stood at Kale's left shoulder, breathing in a way that suggested his secondary respiratory system was working harder than his primary, said, "The sanitation workers' biometrics were so far outside what the system expected that it simply didn't recognize the situation," Kale said. "Categorized it as non-threatening, yes." They both looked at the feed. Nola Briggs had finished the section she was working on and moved her cart 3 meters to the left to start on a stubborn mark near the wall junction. The Dravathi Cub turned its head to watch her move, all 8 eyes tracking the same direction. The Crown Ridge shifted, not by much, but Pell made a small noise and grabbed his own data pad. "That angle," he said, "that's give me a moment." Pell, the Crown Ridge fan, that specific angle, asymmetric left tilt, partial retraction of the secondary spines. He was scrolling through his own research files on the pad. "I've only documented that posture in Dravathi to Dravathi interactions, between adults and juveniles specifically. It's an investigative posture. The juvenile is," he looked up. "It's curious." Kale looked at the feed. The Cub was watching Nola mop with the focused attention of something trying to work out what, exactly, it was looking at. "The pheromone output," Kale said, "at current concentration." Pell pulled the atmospheric readings. He read them. He put the data pad down on the console very carefully and said, in a voice that had lost most of its academic register, "At that concentration, involuntary paralytic shock in any carbon-based organism within 40 meters. Onset time, roughly 90 seconds. She's been in there for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. Soros checked his screen. "Sir, she's been in active pheromone exposure for over 6 minutes. Her biometrics show a mild elevation in heart rate consistent with mild surprise." He paused. That was all. Kale looked at the feed for a long moment. Then he picked up the comm. "Briggs, Nola Briggs, this is Director Kale from the Command Observation Tier." He kept his voice level. He had done this 16 times in his career, talking people through containment situations, and his voice was good at level. "I need you to put down the mop and move very slowly toward the East Corridor exit." On the feed, Nola Briggs looked up at the camera. She had the expression of someone who had been interrupted mid-task and was being polite about it. "Oh, hi," she gave a small wave. "Is this about the Dravathi Cub? Because I was going to mention him. I'm not sure he's supposed to be in this sector." A sound came from somewhere in the command tier that Kale could not immediately identify. He thought it might have been Soros. "That's correct," Kale said. "He is not supposed to be in that sector, which is why I need you to move toward." "He seems pretty upset," Nola said, looking back at the Cub. "Like, look how stiff he is. That's not comfortable." She turned back to the camera. "Is his enclosure nearby? He might calm down if he can smell something familiar." Pelvarath touched Kale's arm with his lower right hand. His upper hands were already pulling up the emergency intervention menu. "She's going to get herself killed," Pell said very quietly. "I'm aware," Kale said. He authorized all 9 intervention tiers at once. The first thing they tried was the pheromone suppression field. The IBCA's Xenobiology Division had spent 14 years, and a significant portion of the Concordance's annual research budget, developing chemical compounds specifically designed to neutralize Dravathi paralytic output and reduce predatory arousal states. The idea was that if you could flood a space with the right combination of suppressants, you could bring an agitated Dravathi down to something approaching a manageable baseline without physical contact. The compounds hissed out of every vent in Sector 4. The atmospheric processors confirmed full dispersal in 8 seconds. The Dravathi Cub sneezed. It was a surprisingly small sound for something that size. A short, sharp exhale that ruffled the fur around its lower jaw joints and caused it to blink 3 of its 8 eyes in sequence. "Bless you," Nola said. The cub looked at her. Kale watched the aggression index on his monitor. It had not gone down. It had also not gone up. The cub was simply looking at the human with the particular focus of a creature that had decided something was worth thinking about. "Pheromone field. No effect," Saurus reported in his reading numbers because there is nothing else I can do voice. "I can see that," Kale said. Round 2. The acoustic deterrence team had been standing by since the first alarm. Frequency DRAV-9 was the only sound in the known spectrum clinically shown to cause genuine sensory disruption in Dravathi neural structures. Not pain, exactly, but a disorienting interference with their threat assessment processing that typically produced a withdrawal response. It had worked in 17 documented cases. The team deployed it through the sector's speaker array in under 4 seconds. The cub's crown ridge flattened slightly. Its markings stuttered in their cycling pattern, going briefly dim before resuming. Nola Briggs put a hand over one ear. "Ow," she said. "That's genuinely unpleasant. Could you please turn that off?" The cub turned its head toward Nola. Just its head, all 8 eyes shifting to track her face. The crown ridge, still partially flattened from the sound, tilted in the left asymmetric angle that Pell had identified 40 seconds ago as investigative. The aggressive red of the bioluminescent markings along its left flank softened, briefly, to something closer to amber. Kale watched the aggression index tick down 2 points. He had no explanation for it. The suppression field had done nothing. The sonic deterrent had done nothing except bother the human, and 2 points had come off the index because she had said ow. "Pell," Kale said. "I see it," Pell said. He was writing something very fast on his data pad. "I don't have an explanation. I'm working on one." Round 3. The sedative deployment team had loaded 3 canisters rated for a mature adult Dravathi, roughly 4 times the concentration needed to affect a juvenile. They came through the atmospheric vent system, precision targeted to land within 2 meters of the cub in a triangulated pattern, timed to release on impact. The canisters hit. 3 small metallic sounds, plink, 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 one after another, bouncing off the cub's dorsal armor plating and clattering to the floor. The cub did not look at them. It was still looking at Nola. "I think he's curious," Nola said, to no one in particular, watching the cub with the expression of someone observing something genuinely interesting. "About me, I mean. He keeps looking at my face." Saurus read his console. "Sedatives, no penetration of natural armor, concentration at floor level is," he checked. "Approximately 40% of target area, the cub is not in contact with the floor." "Its feet," Kale said. "The pads of Dravathi feet are heavily keratinized. The compounds aren't absorbing." Saurus looked at his screen with the expression of a man watching a building fall over very slowly. "Sir, I have a reading from the biometric array that I want to flag." "What?" "The containment field sensor has run another threat assessment. It's come back with—" He stopped. "Saurus." "No threat detected, sir." Saurus turned to look at Kale directly, which he almost never did. "The system is not recognizing the situation as a containment emergency because the only living organism it can register in the active zone is still showing." "Calm," Kale said. "Yes, sir." A pause. "I want to note for the record that I understand the readings are accurate. I find them troubling in a different way now." Pell made a sound beside Kale that had no academic register left in it at all. Round 4 had been the containment field. It had failed before it started, for reasons they were now all fully aware of. Round 5 was the lunchbox. Kale saw it happen before he understood what he was seeing. On the feed, Nola reached back to her cart and paused for half a second, checking that it wasn't blocking the corridor, the unconscious habit of someone who had spent years working in shared spaces and never lost the reflex. Then she turned back to the cub. She reached past the bottles of cleaning solution on the cart's side shelf, found the compartment she was looking for, and untwisted a small length of electrical wire from around a broken latch. She opened the container. It was pale green, scratched, rectangular, the kind of thing you picked up at a market and kept until it fell apart. A small cloud of something, warmth, maybe, or the faint trace of whatever was inside, drifted into the feed's atmospheric sensor data and registered as organic compounds, Earth origin spices, low concentration, non-threatening. The smell of someone's lunch. Here, Nola said, her voice had gone quieter. Not careful quiet, the way people got when they were trying not to startle something dangerous. Just softer, the way people talked when they were paying full attention to something small and worth being gentle with. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." She held out a piece of food. The cub's crown ridge moved. Kale had the research files on his second monitor. He had pulled them up 20 minutes ago and hadn't closed them. He watched the crown ridge shift from the full threat fan, all secondary spines extended, primary ridge at maximum height, to a different angle entirely. Partial retraction of the secondary spines. Primary ridge at about 60% tilting left, asymmetric. Kale said. Pell was already looking. He had already picked up his data pad. He was already pulling up a specific file, his fingers moving the way they moved when he had found something that mattered and was trying to get to it fast. He found the page. He read it. He read it again. His gill slits went very flat. That posture, Pell said. His voice had the quality of someone speaking from a long distance away, inside a very quiet room. The crown ridge angle, the secondary spine configuration, the left asymmetric tilt. He held up the data pad so Kale could see the diagram without looking away from the feed. I documented that posture for the first time 9 years ago. I have observed it in exactly 11 instances since then. He paused. Every single instance was a Dravathi juvenile in direct contact with a Dravathi parent or bonded adult. It is an investigative comfort posture. The juvenile is assessing whether the other organism is. He stopped. The cub leaned forward very slightly and sniffed the food Nola was holding out. Safe, Pell said. The juvenile is assessing whether the other organism is safe. No one in the command tier said anything. Nola waited, her hands steady, her face open in the uncomplicated way of someone who had done this before, held out her hand to something that was deciding whether to trust her, and had learned that the waiting was just part of it, and you didn't rush the waiting. The cub's crown ridge tilted another degree. 12:22. The cub took the food. It happened slowly, a deliberate extension of the long neck, 8 eyes on Nola's face the whole time, the enormous jaws opening with a careful precision that nothing in the physical profile had suggested was possible. It took the piece of food from her hand with a gentleness that stopped every person in the command tier mid-breath. Good boy, Nola said. The sensors logged it the same flat way sensors logged everything. Aggression index 47, shift from previous reading -31 points. Timestamp 2017-44. Saurus read the number aloud. Then he read it again. Then he looked at Kale with the expression of someone who had just watched a building fall up. That's a data error, said the communications officer from her station at the far end of the room. She had been announcing things for the past 43 minutes in a tone that had long ago stopped containing hope. She said it the way someone says a thing they know isn't true but need to say anyway, because the alternative requires a different kind of thinking entirely. Nobody agreed with her. Nobody disagreed either. On the feed, the cub chewed, slowly, thoughtfully, the way a very large thing chews when it is paying more attention to the company than the food. Round 6 was not in the intervention protocol. Kale had authorized 9 tiers. He had used 5. The remaining 4, 2 more chemical deployments, an emergency atmospheric purge, and a direct contact suppression team with Class 9 gear were still listed as available on his console, and he was becoming increasingly aware that deploying any of them would be, at this point, a kind of absurdity. The cub had settled back slightly on its haunches, not lying down, not pressing forward, the posture of something that was deciding whether to stay. Round 7, Kale said. It came out more quietly than he intended. Pull up the tactical teams, Alpha, Beta, Gamma. Get them to the sector entrance. The teams moved. Kale watched their position markers cross the station schematic in real time. 12 personnel, full Class 9 gear, moving fast through Deck 4's outer corridors towards Sector 4's main access point. They arrived in 40 seconds. The team leader's helmet camera came up on Kale's secondary feed. Through the viewport, past the emergency glass, Nola, sitting cross-legged on the floor now, the lunch container open beside her. The Dravathi cub a meter away, crown ridge at about 40%, marking cycling a deep amber rather than red. Its head was lowered to roughly her eye level. She had one hand resting on the floor between them, open, palm up. Sir, the team leader's voice over comms. We are at the sector entrance. A pause. What are our orders? Kale looked at the feed. The cub leaned forward and pressed its jaw against Nola's open palm. Briefly, the way an animal does when it is checking whether the hand is safe or when it has already decided and is just confirming. 11 seconds of silence on the comms line. Hold position, Kale said. Round 8 started with Nola. She looked up at the nearest camera with the same polite attention she had used the first time, the look of someone who was not alarmed but did want to be helpful. I think, she said, you're making this worse. Kale pressed the comm. Briggs. He can probably smell the stress. She gestured vaguely upward in the direction of the atmospheric vents. Whatever you've been running through the air system, I don't know what it is, but it's not helping him. Can you feel that? Sort of a sharp smell like metal and something sour. Kale looked at Saurus. Saurus had already pulled up the atmospheric analysis. He was reading it with the expression of someone who had just found a mistake in a document they had written and signed and handed to their director. The Terthan stress compounds, Saurus said very quietly. The ones the station's climate system vents when it registers elevated cortisol in command personnel. He stopped. He started again. Terthan stress compounds. Sir, the molecular overlap with Dravathi threat activation receptors is, he pulled up a second screen. The overlap is 63%. Nobody spoke. We have been venting stress compounds for 43 minutes, Pelverath said, from somewhere that sounded like the inside of a very small room inside his own head. The station's standard stress management system has been chemically triggering the Cub's alarm response. He sat down. There was no chair where he sat down. He sat down on the floor. We made it worse. Every intervention, everyone, we were making it worse. The field, the sonic array, the sedatives, all of it running on top of a baseline chemical signal, telling that Cub that every organism in this station was terrified of it and preparing to fight. Nola, on the feed, had gone back to sitting quietly with her hand on the floor. And she, Pell said, still from the floor, has no Terthan stress compounds, different species, different biochemistry. From the Cub's perspective, she is the only organism in a 40-meter radius that is not broadcasting a threat signal. He looked at his data pad. He looked at the feed. She smells safe. Pell had written the research. Kale had run the protocols. The station had built the containment. None of it had accounted for a human who smelled like lunch and didn't know to be afraid. Kale reached for the comm panel. He looked at the intervention menu, the 4 remaining tiers, still armed, still listed as authorized. He closed the menu. All teams, he said, hold position, do not advance. He pulled up the atmospheric controls. Cut the sonic array, shut the suppressant vents, shut the stress compound venting system entirely, switch climate management to manual override. He looked at Saurus. What else are we running in there? Saurus checked. The emergency lighting, red spectrum, high intensity, standard for containment breach. Switch it to standard white. Sir, that's standard white, Saurus. A pause, yes, sir. The lights in Sector 4 shifted on the feed. The red emergency wash faded. The space became, in an ordinary way, a station corridor, pale overhead lights, the usual shadows, the scuff marks on the floor that maintenance never quite got to. The Cub blinked, several of its eyes at once. Kale folded all 4 of his hands in his lap. Saurus looked at the other technicians. The communications officer looked at Saurus. The junior analyst at the back of the room, who had not spoken once in 43 minutes, looked at all of them. That gesture, all 4 hands folded still, was not something any of them had seen from Kale. Not in a drill, not in an actual incident, not in any scenario on record. His hands had stopped. On the feed, Nola humming very quietly. Not a song anyone recognized. Just a soft, tuneless pattern of notes, the kind of thing people do when they are comfortable and not thinking about it. The Cub's crown ridge lowered another degree. The communications officer, who had been announcing things every 90 seconds for the past 40 minutes, said nothing. The silence where her voice usually went was somehow louder than anything she had said. The Cub's neural activity monitor, a secondary feed Pell had pulled up on the left screen, began to shift. The spikes and oscillations of an agitated Dravathi nervous system were changing shape, flattening, smoothing, moving toward something Kale didn't have a classification for. Pell, he said. Pell was already on his feet, already at the screen, his gill slits cycling fast. Slow-wave neural cycling, Pell said. The Cub's brain is shifting into rest state. He touched the screen. Kale, this is the neural signature for, he stopped. He pulled up his research files. He found the page. He read it once. He closed the file. It's going to sleep. The air in the command tier did not change. The ventilation ran the same. The monitors hummed the same. But something in the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Saurus checked his scanner from reflex. The battery indicator first, an unconscious habit, then brought it up to his eye. He read the number. He read it again. He looked at the feed. The Cub's markings had gone still, not cycling, not pulsing. Dark the way they looked in sleep, the way they had looked in no photograph on record, because no researcher had ever been close enough to a Dravathi while it was sleeping to document it. The crown ridge folded flat against its skull. All 8 eyes closed. All 4 forelimbs tucked beneath its body in the compact position. The small, folded posture that the research files noted Dravathi parents spent years conditioning their young out of, because it left the juvenile too exposed, because Dravathi did not sleep without walls around them, because they did not rest in open spaces, because they did not trust the air to stay safe without their eyes in it. "It's sleeping," Sora said. No one in the command tier said anything. Not operational silence. Not the silence of people waiting for the next alert or the next number to change. The silence of people who understood, in a concrete and immediate way, that they were looking at something that had not happened in 11,000 years, and that they were going to spend a significant portion of the rest of their professional lives trying to describe it accurately, and that the description was never going to be quite right. Nola Briggs, on the feed, looked at the cub. She looked at it for a moment with the quiet expression of someone who had sat with many animals and knew what it meant when they finally let themselves go. Then she shifted, very slowly, so she was leaning against the wall instead of sitting straight, and settled the cub's head more comfortably on her lap without waking it. The lunch container was still open beside her, the pale green of it bright under the white lights. "Get me the senior research team," Kale said. His voice had changed, not louder, not softer, but different in some quality he would have struggled to name. "Just get them here. Let them see it themselves. I'll brief them after." Then he added, because it was the only thing left to add, "And someone please make sure Nola Briggs is receiving hazard pay." The parents arrived without docking clearance. The proximity alert came through at 21:04, a Dravathi-class vessel, collective registration, approaching at a speed that made no allowance for station traffic patterns or standard approach vectors. The communications officer flagged it. Kale looked at the registration and already knew. They had felt it somehow, the way parents did, or the collective's intelligence network was faster than the IBCA's diplomatic channel. Either way, they were here. Kale authorized emergency docking on Bay 7 and opened the comms himself. The translation came through in the flat, clipped tones of an automatic relay. The collective used their own system, not the concordance standard, and the IBCA translator had a 3-second lag. "You have our offspring. Your offspring is safe," Kale said. "I need you to listen to me before you board." A pause, the 3-second lag. Then, "We are boarding now." They came through Bay 7's inner lock and into Wellport 6 main corridors at a pace that made the deck sensors log their weight signature twice, because the first reading seemed too fast to be accurate. Kale watched them on the corridor feeds, 2 adult Dravathi, crown ridges at full extension, markings bright red, moving through a station hallway the way storms move through coastlines. Other personnel pressed against the walls. Some ran. The systems had cleared Deck 4 already. The 2 Dravathi reached the Sector 4 corridor in under 4 minutes from docking. They stopped at the viewport. Through the reinforced glass, their offspring, asleep, in the arms of a human sanitation worker who had tilted her head back against the wall and appeared to have half-dozed off herself, one hand resting on the cub's folded crown. The cub slept, the parents stared. The galaxy ran out of words. The mother's crown ridge, fully fanned at maximum threat display when she had walked in, did something no researcher present had a classification for. It did not retract. That would have been a de-escalation response, and there were 12 entries on the Dravathi behavioral scale that covered those. This was not on the scale. The primary ridge lowered slightly to one side. The secondary spines shifted inward, not flat, not fanned, something between the two that the junior researcher in the corridor behind them later described in her incident notes as the expression a face makes when it is trying not to make a sound. The cub shifted in its sleep, made a small noise, low, brief, completely content, and burrowed closer to Nola without waking. The father's markings stuttered, went briefly, completely dark, then came back up at half their previous intensity. Neither of them moved. Kale watched on the feed and did not speak, and did not order anyone else to speak. The mother pressed one forelimb against the viewport glass. Slowly. The gesture had no name in the behavioral record. Nola woke up when the door opened. She looked at the 2 adult Dravathi in the doorway and blinked, the way people blink when they are coming back from somewhere quiet. She did not run. "Oh," she said, "are these his parents?" No handlers, no weapons, no fear. Just a woman sitting on a station floor with someone's child asleep in her lap, looking at 2 enormous and ancient and furious things in the doorway, and seeing, with absolute plainness, 2 parents who had just found their kid. The father stepped forward. His voice through the translation relay was flat in the way that meant something was pressing against the flatness from inside. "What have you done to our offspring?" "Fed him," Nola said. "Sat with him." She looked at the cub. "He was scared." "Dravathi do not become scared. All young things get scared." She said it the way she said everything, no argument in it, no performance. Just the thing she had observed, stated plainly. They just don't all have someone who lets them show it. The corridor was very quiet. The mother looked at her offspring's face. The compact sleeping posture, 4 limbs tucked, crown folded, the small curled shape that she had spent 3 years conditioning him away from, because it was vulnerable, because the galaxy was not safe, because you did not show that shape to anything that could see you. He was showing it now. He has never slept like this, she said. The translation relay made it flat. What was underneath the flat was not. I know, Nola said. She looked at the mother with the direct, warm attention she gave everything. Here, let me show you how to hold him. She shifted the cub gently, demonstrating the position. The weight of it, the angle of the arm, the way you kept contact without waking them up. She talked through it the same way she talked through everything, low, steady, no performance. The mother lowered herself to the floor. Slowly, the way something very large moves when it is being careful about something very small. She adjusted her grip. She went still. The cub did not wake up. The expression on the mother's face, what the crown ridge settled into, what the markings did at that particular intensity and angle, had no entry in any behavioral record. The junior researcher with the incident notes wrote 3 attempts at a description and crossed all 3 out. She left the field blank. Sometimes the honest record is the blank field. Kale, watching the feed from the command tier, said quietly to no one, "We're going to need to reclassify a lot of things." His voice had stopped shaking. He did not sound like a man who had just survived a crisis. He sounded like a man who had just understood something and was now looking at everything he thought he knew and checking which parts still fit. He was not thinking only about the cub. 6 days later, the formal session of the Interspecies Biological Concordance convened on record time. The proposal on the table was a reclassification, upward from isolation tier to contact tier, the first upward reclassification in concordance history. The previous direction had only ever gone one way. The vote was not close. Pelverath submitted his proposal for human consultants at every biological containment station in the network, with a specific section on interspecies com-state communication, and what he was now calling, in his drafts, baseline trust transmission. He had spent 4 days writing it. He had spent most of the 4th day rewriting the abstract, because the first 3 versions had used the word impossible in ways he no longer believed were accurate. The Dravathi Collective's formal response to the concordance arrived 2 days after the vote. It requested a cultural exchange program to begin at a date of the collective's choosing. It included, in a separate appended document that the translation office had to run twice to confirm they had read correctly, a specific inquiry about dogs. Pelverath stood at the threshold of Sector 4 on the afternoon of the 7th day. He had his data pad. He had the file open, his most cited paper, 11 years of citations, the foundational text on Dravathi predatory behavior that had shaped every containment protocol in use across 47 stations. The junior researcher assigned to document the retraction stood 2 meters behind him with a recorder, and later noted in her report that he had stood at the threshold for almost a full minute before speaking. When he spoke, he did not look devastated. He looked, she wrote, like someone who had been waiting for something to be wrong for a very long time, and was relieved that it finally was, because that meant it could finally be corrected. He read the formal retraction into the record. His voice was steady. On Deck 7, in the family suite the IBCA had cleared and reconfigured in 48 hours. The mother held her offspring the way Nola had shown her. She had practiced it 3 times the night before, alone, until the angle felt right. She held him now and looked at his face, the closed eyes, the folded crown, the small, trusting shape of him, and the expression she had was the one with no name in the behavioral record. She did not try to name it. Nola pushed her cart off the elevator on Deck 11 and started on the port-side corridors, which were always the longer run because of the junction layout. She hummed, tunelessly, the same pattern of notes she always hummed, which meant nothing and had no source she could have identified if someone had asked. She didn't know about the council vote. She hadn't heard about Pell's retraction. No one had told her about the collective's inquiry, or the cultural exchange proposal, or the 17 research teams that had submitted applications to study the event logs from Sector 4 on the night of the 18th. She pushed the cart around the corner. The pale green container bounced on the side of it, the broken latch rattling faintly against the wire she had twisted back into place. 3 decks up, the Concordance was drafting resolutions about humanity's place in the galaxy. On Deck 4, the thing that had changed everything was an insulated lunch box with a broken latch, and a person who never thought to be afraid. The cart turned the corner. The corridor was empty. The alarms were off.